The sun had just begun to set over Chicago, casting an orange hue over the city skyline. But inside the quiet, suburban apartment of Jessica Walker, the light from the living room lamp flickered as she nervously adjusted her wedding dress. She was 2 days away from marrying the man of her dreams, Ryan Thompson, a successful businessman who was everything she'd ever wanted. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. 2 days before her wedding, she found herself standing in front of her ex-boyfriend's apartment, taking a deep breath before knocking. Brandon Blake, her former lover, had once been her everything. They'd shared moments of passion, laughter, and dreams, but somewhere along the way, their relationship fell apart. Yet even after years of moving on, there was a part of her that never truly left him. Tonight was meant to be a farewell romance, a chance to say goodbye, to close the chapter on a relationship that had meant so much. She wasn't looking for anything more, but Brandon, with his deep brown eyes and the same magnetic charm, made it hard to walk away completely. Brandon opened the door with a mix of surprise and a strange excitement. The tension between them was palpable, as if the years apart had only intensified the feelings they once shared. "I wasn't expecting you," Brandon said softly, stepping aside to let her in. Jessica smiled faintly, but there was a look in her eyes, a flicker of sadness that only Brandon seemed to notice. "I thought maybe we should talk. One last time, before I get married," she said. Brandon's eyes darkened. There was something in his gaze that made Jessica uneasy, but she brushed it off. She was here to tie up loose ends, to move on with her life. "Of course," Brandon replied, his voice tight. "Come in." As they sat down on the couch, the conversation started light, the usual small talk of catching up, but soon the words between them grew heavier. Brandon had never liked Ryan, and Jessica could feel the tension building. "You're making a mistake, Jess," Brandon said, his voice growing more urgent. "Ryan is not the one for you. You know that. We were good together. We had something real." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't say anything. She could feel the heat rising in her chest as Brandon's words hit too close to home. But she reminded herself, this was just one final meeting. No more. "Brandon," she said softly, "I'm getting married. I'm moving on. This is my life now." Brandon's expression shifted in an instant. His face turned pale, his jaw clenched, and his fist tightened at his sides. "I can't let you go," he whispered. The change was subtle at first, but Jessica noticed it immediately. There was a sense of desperation in his voice, a kind of madness that sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, he moved closer to her, his hand reaching for her face. She instinctively pulled back, her heart racing. "Brandon, this isn't you. I'm happy now." But Brandon's expression darkened, his breath quickening as the silence between them grew unbearable. He stood up suddenly, his eyes wild with a mixture of pain and rage. "I'll never let you go," he repeated, his voice low and guttural. Jessica stood up, panic rising in her chest. "Brandon, you're not thinking clearly. I'm sorry, but I have to go." Now, before she could reach the door, Brandon lunged at her, grabbing her by the wrist and slamming her against the wall. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he hissed, his breath hot on her neck. Jessica struggled, but the grip on her wrist was like iron. "Let me go! Brandon!" But there was no stopping him. His jealousy and anger had consumed him, and in the heat of the moment, he did something unthinkable. With a swift motion, Brandon grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase on the coffee table, and smashed it across Jessica's head. The room went dark as she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Jessica never made it to her wedding. Her body was discovered the next morning, unconscious and bleeding in Brandon's apartment. But the damage had been done. The police would soon be called, and Brandon Blake's world would unravel. The morning after Jessica's visit to Brandon's apartment, the city of Chicago began its usual bustling rhythm. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting its golden light over the streets. But for Ryan Thompson, the groom-to-be, the morning was anything but typical. Ryan had woken up early, eager to begin the preparations for his wedding in just 2 days. He reached for his phone to check the messages, But something about the silence of the apartment felt off. There were no calls from Jessica, no texts, no updates on the wedding plans. She's probably just caught up with her last-minute errands, he told himself, trying to shake off the nagging feeling in his gut. But as the hours passed, Ryan's anxiety began to grow. The woman he was about to marry was missing, and no one had heard from her. The more he called, the more confused he became. It wasn't like Jessica to disappear without a word. By late afternoon, when Jessica still hadn't returned to her apartment or responded to Ryan's calls, he reached out to the police. He tried to remain calm, but the rising panic in his chest was hard to ignore. Detective Sarah Parker, a seasoned investigator with the Chicago Police Department, took the call. Ryan had provided a brief description of Jessica's last known whereabouts and her visit to her ex-boyfriend's, Brandon Blake's, apartment. Parker's mind immediately went into overdrive. It wasn't unusual for an ex to have unresolved feelings, but the situation seemed urgent. "I need you to stay calm," Detective Parker instructed Ryan over the phone, her voice steady and professional. "We'll take it from here. I'll send a unit to Brandon Blake's place and start looking into it." Within hours, a team of officers was dispatched to Brandon Blake's apartment. As they arrived, they noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, and the apartment was eerily quiet. Detective Parker led the way as she entered the apartment, her flashlight sweeping over the dimly lit living room. The place seemed ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. But as they moved deeper into the space, something caught her eye. A large blood-stained vase was lying on the floor next to the couch. It was cracked in several places, and the surrounding area showed signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, and a sense of chaos that seemed out of place. As they continued searching, one of the officers noticed something. Behind the sofa, Jessica's body was sprawled on the floor, her head resting at an unnatural angle. The blood around her head pooled in dark, heavy clumps. "This isn't good," Parker muttered under her breath, her gut telling her that things had gone from bad to worse. Jessica was unconscious, but she still had a faint pulse. The officers quickly radioed for medical assistance, and she was rushed to the hospital, but the severity of her injuries left little hope. Parker's mind raced as she examined the scene. It didn't take long for the evidence to point in one direction: Brandon Blake. After Jessica was taken to the hospital, Parker and her team rushed to track down Brandon. He was still the prime suspect, given his history with Jessica. It wasn't hard to find him. He was at his job, working as a mechanic at a local garage, when the police arrived to bring him in for questioning. Brandon, at first, was cooperative, though visibly shaken. He denied any involvement in Jessica's injury, stating that he hadn't seen her after she left his apartment the night before. "I swear, Detective," Brandon said, his voice trembling. "She came by to talk and we had some drinks. She left around midnight. That's the last time I saw her." Parker narrowed her eyes. There was something about his story that didn't add up. The blood-stained vase, the signs of struggle in the apartment. It didn't fit with the image he was trying to present. "You're lying, Brandon," Parker said, her voice cold. "We've got evidence at your apartment. We've also got your fingerprints all over the vase. You're not going to talk your way out of this one." Brandon's face turned pale, and his hands began to shake. His bravado crumbled, revealing the panic beneath. But still, he stuck to his story. "I didn't hurt her," he shouted. "I swear I didn't." As Parker and her team examined the scene further, they uncovered more evidence. The broken vase was a clear indicator of violence, and the fact that Brandon's fingerprints were on it only made things more suspicious. But the key piece of evidence that turned the tide in the investigation was found in Jessica's purse. A text message from the night of the incident. "Don't worry, I'll see you tonight. One last time. I just need closure." The message was sent from Jessica to Brandon, and it suggested that she was indeed planning to visit him for a final goodbye. But it didn't explain why Jessica had been left in such a condition. The more Parker thought about it, the more she believed that Brandon's jealousy had been the catalyst for the violence. He couldn't stand the idea of Jessica moving on, getting married to another man. The anger inside him had built up over time, and now it had tragically spilled over. With mounting evidence, Parker was more certain than ever. Brandon Blake was the one who had attacked Jessica. And it wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a case of jealousy gone too far. The days following Jessica's discovery were filled with tension and mounting frustration. While she remained in a critical condition in the hospital, her survival hung by a thread, and Detective Sarah Parker had to work fast. Every piece of evidence seemed to point in one direction, Brandon Blake, but they needed more to solidify the case. Time was running out, and Parker knew it was only a matter of time before Jessica's condition either improved or took a turn for the worse. Parker stood outside the hospital room, staring at the door. Inside, doctors and nurses were doing everything they could to save Jessica. The woman who had been caught in the crossfire of Brandon Blake's jealousy was fighting for her life. Parker could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her. Jessica was the only one who could truly tell them what had happened, but with her injuries, she wasn't able to provide any answers. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened. A nurse stepped out, shaking her head. "She's still unconscious, Detective. Her condition hasn't improved, and there's still a lot of swelling around the brain. It's too early to say if she'll make it." Parker nodded, her heart sinking. Jessica was strong, but even the strongest of people couldn't withstand that kind of trauma forever. "Keep me updated," Parker said before heading toward the elevator. She needed to dig deeper. Back at the station, Parker called in Brandon Blake for another round of questioning. She had all the evidence she needed to charge him with assault, but there was something gnawing at her. She wasn't convinced that he had acted alone in this. Brandon's actions seemed too premeditated for a crime of passion. When Brandon walked into the interrogation room, he was visibly exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were still trembling. It was clear that the gravity of the situation was starting to sink in, but he held his ground when he sat down across from Parker. "Brandon, you need to start talking," Parker said, her voice firm. "We know you hurt her. We have the evidence. And we know you were the last person to see her alive before she was found unconscious in your apartment." Brandon was quiet for a long time, but when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen. I swear to you, Detective." He paused, his eyes shifting nervously. "I didn't hurt her on purpose." Parker leaned forward. "Then why did you hit her? Why was she found unconscious in your apartment?" "I don't believe your story, Brandon. It's not adding up." Brandon swallowed hard, tears welling up in his eyes. "I never wanted her to leave me. She was everything to me. When she told me she was getting married to Ryan, His voice cracked, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I was angry. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking, if I just got her back, things would go back to normal." Parker listened closely, her mind racing. Jealousy. It had always been there. But this was deeper than just a lover's quarrel. He wasn't just angry, he was obsessed. "So, you attacked her?" Parker pressed. "No." Brandon's voice rose, and he quickly tried to calm himself. "I didn't mean to hurt her. It just happened. We were arguing, and she said she was going to leave. I just couldn't stand the thought of losing her forever. I lost control. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand." Parker's gut told her that Brandon was hiding something. He was admitting guilt, but he wasn't fully coming clean. "I need to know everything, Brandon," she said. "What really happened that night? Don't hold anything back." Brandon's hands gripped the edge of the table, and he looked down at the floor. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't just hurt her. I was so desperate to get her back that I poisoned her." Parker's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean you poisoned her?" Brandon's face twisted with guilt. "I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted her to stay. I had this plan. I made her some ice cream, and I added something to it. It was just supposed to make her sick. I thought she would forgive me after she recovered, but I never thought it would go this far." Parker felt a chill spread over her. This was far worse than she had imagined. The level of premeditation that Brandon had shown by planning the poisoning was staggering. He hadn't just reacted in the heat of the moment, he had calculated it. "Do you realize what you've done?" Parker asked, her voice cold. "I never meant for her to get hurt," Brandon muttered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I loved her. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her." But it wasn't just Jessica who had been affected by Brandon's actions. There was more to the story. When Parker had examined the evidence earlier, she discovered something shocking. Jessica's 3 children had also eaten the poisoned ice cream. Parker's mind raced. How had the kids been involved? Was Brandon aware that they had eaten it? Did you know that Jessica's kids ate the ice cream too? Parker asked sharply. Brandon's face went pale. He stammered, struggling to get the words out. I, I didn't know. I swear. I never meant for anyone else to get hurt. But it was too late. The poison had done its damage. The children had been lucky. They had only eaten a small amount, but it was enough to make them sick. The hospital staff had been able to treat them quickly, and they were now stable. As Brandon's confession sank in, Detective Parker knew the case was far from over. She had enough to charge him with attempted murder and poisoning, but the true depth of his obsession and jealousy would be revealed in the trial. Parker left the interrogation room feeling both satisfied and sickened. She knew that Jessica's fight for survival was now a race against time, but she had one more question lingering in her mind. If Brandon had truly loved Jessica, why had he gone so far? And more importantly, what kind of person would deliberately poison the woman he claimed to love, just to hold on to her? These questions would follow Parker through the case, but for now the investigation had taken a crucial step forward. Brandon Blake was no longer a suspect, he was a criminal. The interrogation with Brandon Blake had been a breakthrough, but Detective Sarah Parker knew there was still much more to uncover. She had his confession on record, but Jessica's survival was still uncertain, and with the 3 children involved, the case was growing increasingly complex. As she sat at her desk, the weight of the case pressed down on her. There were too many unanswered questions, and she needed to be thorough. Every detail mattered. The hospital had confirmed that Jessica's 3 children, though shaken, were out of immediate danger. However, Parker knew that their involvement in the case couldn't be ignored. It was essential to understand their experiences during the night of the incident. She arranged for the children to be interviewed by a child psychologist, with herself and a few officers present to ensure that they were not overwhelmed by the situation. The children were no older than 10, 8, and 6. The youngest, Lily, was still too small to fully comprehend the severity of what had happened. But the 2 older children, Ethan and Sophia, had clearer memories of the night. Ethan was the first to speak. He seemed a bit reluctant at first, but opened up as the psychologist, Dr. Amy Bell, gently coaxed him into sharing his story. I remember Mom told us not to eat too much of the ice cream, but we didn't listen, Ethan said in a quiet voice. It was really good. She said we could have some, but not too much. But we kept asking, and she finally gave us some. Sophia nodded, confirming what her brother had said. It tasted funny, though. I didn't like it, but I ate it anyway. I thought it was because we had it after dinner. Parker took detailed notes. The children's testimonies aligned with the timeline of the poisoning. They had eaten the ice cream after Jessica had been poisoned, and from what they said, they hadn't been aware that anything was wrong with it. The fact that the ice cream had tasted funny was concerning, but it also hinted at Brandon's lack of control over the situation. What happened after you ate the ice cream? Parker asked gently. Sophia's eyes filled with fear. I felt really sick. My tummy hurt, and then I threw up. Ethan was okay for a little while, but then he started feeling bad too. Ethan nodded, looking upset as he recalled the events. Mom didn't feel good either. She went to lay down on the couch, but she looked tired and we thought she was just sleeping. Parker noted down their responses, realizing that the children had been incredibly lucky to avoid severe harm. They had ingested a smaller amount of poison, enough to make them sick, but not enough to cause life-threatening damage. The fact that they were already recovering was a relief, but it didn't change the fact that this had been a carefully orchestrated crime. Brandon's confession had shed light on his jealousy and obsession with Jessica, but Parker needed to dig deeper into his background to understand what had driven him to such drastic actions. She went back to his apartment to search for more evidence that could explain his motive. The apartment was neat, but Parker's trained eyes immediately noticed something strange. A stack of old letters that Brandon had kept in a drawer. They were from Jessica. Parker opened them cautiously, and what she found sent a cold chill down her spine. The letters were filled with words of longing, love, and regret. but they also revealed the intensity of Brandon's emotions. One of the letters, dated a few months before Jessica's engagement to Ryan, caught Parker's attention. It read, "I can't stop thinking about you. I know I messed up, but I'm not ready to let you go. I can't see you marry anyone else. You're meant to be with me. Please don't leave me. Don't let someone else take you away." The intensity of the words was staggering. It was clear that Brandon's obsession with Jessica had been growing for some time. His inability to accept her moving on and finding happiness with someone else had fueled a growing resentment. Parker couldn't help but wonder if this obsession had escalated with Jessica's upcoming wedding to Ryan. Was it the idea of her moving on that finally pushed him to act? She continued to go through the rest of the letters. In some, Brandon had asked for Jessica's forgiveness, pleading with her to reconsider their relationship. Others were angry, accusing her of being unfaithful, despite the fact that Jessica had broken up with him long before she met Ryan. As Parker sat in her office, the toxicology report from the lab came in. The results were as expected. Jessica had ingested a lethal amount of ricin, a highly toxic substance that was often difficult to detect in smaller quantities. It was clear that Brandon had known what he was doing when he poisoned her. The report also confirmed that the children had consumed small doses of ricin, which explained their nausea and vomiting, but ultimately saved them from long-term harm. Parker knew the next step was to gather more information about Brandon's access to the poison. She reached out to a contact at the local chemistry supply store, asking if Brandon had purchased anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the incident. Within hours, her suspicions were confirmed. Brandon had bought a vial of ricin online. By the end of the day, Parker had uncovered a horrifying revelation. Brandon had been planning this for weeks. He had purchased the ricin months before, carefully researching how to use it to poison someone. His motive had been to force Jessica back into his life, not to kill her. He had hoped that poisoning her would make her dependent on him, thus giving him another chance to win her back. But when the poison took hold of her, it was clear that Brandon had underestimated its effect. As Parker prepared for the next round of questioning with Brandon, she knew this case was far from over. The evidence was mounting, but the psychological complexity of Brandon's actions was troubling. Why did he feel entitled to Jessica's love, even to the point of hurting her? What had he hoped to achieve by poisoning her and putting the children at risk? In the coming days, Parker would need to piece together the full picture of Brandon's life, his obsession with Jessica, and the horrific events that led to her poisoning. But for now, all she could do was wait for Jessica to regain consciousness and pray that she would be able to give her the final pieces of the puzzle. The morning air was crisp, the sun peeking through the blinds as Detective Sarah Parker arrived at the hospital. Her heart raced, not only because of the weight of the case, but also because today she would be speaking to Jessica. After days of being in a coma, Jessica had finally regained consciousness. Parker knew the conversation would be crucial. It could be the turning point that would tie together the final threads of the investigation. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Jessica lay in the bed, her face pale but free of the tubes and wires that had once connected her to machines. Her eyes fluttered open when Parker entered, a weak smile forming on Jessica's lips. "Detective Parker," Jessica whispered hoarsely, her voice still shaky from the effects of the poison. "I didn't think I'd make it." Parker smiled softly, trying to reassure her. "You're strong, Jessica. You made it through. We're going to make sure everything comes to light." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry for what happened. My children, I can't believe they ate it too. I never meant for them to get hurt." Parker took a seat next to the bed, her voice firm but compassionate. "You need to focus on getting better. We're going to find out who did this to you, and we won't let them get away with it." Jessica nodded weakly. "I know who did this," she said, her voice trembling. "It was Brandon." The words hit Parker like a thunderclap. She had suspected it for weeks, but hearing Jessica say it confirmed everything. Parker leaned forward, her pen ready to take notes. "Can you tell me what happened? What made you go to Brandon's place that night?" Jessica took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the weight of the memories. She looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It was 2 days before my wedding," she began. "I went to see Brandon. I didn't want to. I knew I was getting married, but I felt I owed him a proper farewell. We'd spent so many years together, I just thought we needed some closure. Parker listened intently, her mind racing. She had known about the tumultuous history between Jessica and Brandon, but hearing it from Jessica herself added a new layer of understanding. I thought we could talk one last time, get some closure. Jessica continued. I told him I was happy with Ryan. He was going to be my husband, and I was ready to move on. I thought Brandon had accepted it. Jessica paused, her face contorting with pain. But he didn't. He begged me to stay. He said he couldn't let me go, that he loved me. I told him it was over, and that's when I saw it in his eyes. The anger, the jealousy. I should have left then, but I didn't. I felt sorry for him. Parker nodded slowly, processing Jessica's words. And the ice cream? What happened there? I didn't think anything of it. He offered me the ice cream and I didn't even hesitate. I thought it was a simple gesture, just something to share one last time, Jessica explained. I didn't know what he had done to it. When I ate it, I thought it tasted a bit off, but I brushed it aside. Her voice broke, and tears welled in her eyes. I remember feeling dizzy after eating it. I didn't know what was happening. I thought it was just stress or exhaustion. But then, it hit me, like a wave of nausea, and my heart started racing. I couldn't breathe. Parker's mind was racing as Jessica spoke. This was more than just an act of jealousy. It was an obsession. Brandon had known exactly what he was doing, and the fact that he had targeted Jessica at such a vulnerable moment, the eve of her wedding, spoke volumes about his need for control. And the children? Parker asked gently, trying to keep her voice steady. Jessica's face darkened. I never wanted them to get involved. I didn't even think they'd eat the ice cream. But they begged for more, and I caved. They always do. I just didn't know that it was poison. With Jessica's confirmation, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Parker knew Brandon had been following Jessica's every move, growing increasingly desperate as her wedding day approached. This wasn't just a breakup. It was about possession, about maintaining control over Jessica, even if it meant destroying her happiness. Parker's investigation had revealed that Brandon had been increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to the poisoning. He'd shown up at Jessica's house unannounced, called her multiple times, and even sent her letters pleading for another chance. His behavior had become more extreme, more irrational. Now Parker had the confirmation she needed. Brandon had poisoned Jessica's ice cream in a final attempt to make her his, using the children as collateral damage in his sick, twisted game. With the solid evidence and Jessica's testimony, the next step was clear. Detective Parker and her team moved quickly. They arrived at Brandon's apartment that evening, armed with a warrant for his arrest. Brandon was at home, pacing nervously when the officers knocked. His face turned pale when he saw them. Brandon Blake, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Jessica Turner and the poisoning of her children, Parker said, her voice cold and firm. Brandon's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, he looked like he might try to escape. But the sight of the officers closing in on him stopped him. He raised his hands in surrender, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had come crashing down on him. As they read him his rights and escorted him out of the apartment, Brandon's gaze shifted towards the ground, a mix of guilt and regret in his eyes. But it was too late. His jealousy had destroyed everything. As the days passed, Parker couldn't help but think about the twisted nature of the crime. Brandon's actions were driven by obsession, a sense of entitlement that had led him to believe he had the right to control Jessica's future. And in his desperation, he had caused irreparable harm, not just to her, but to her children as well. Jessica was recovering, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of the poisoning would stay with her, but she had taken the first steps towards healing. She had a new life ahead of her with Ryan, and Parker was certain that the support of her family and friends would help her move forward. But the case wasn't just about the victims. It was also about Brandon's darkness. He had once been a man Jessica had loved, but his actions had turned him into a monster. As Parker closed the case file, she knew that her work was done. Justice had been served, but the memory of the case would linger with her for some time. She just hoped that Jessica and the children could find peace after all the chaos they had been through. The door closed softly behind her as Parker left the precinct. the weight of the case now a distant echo. Justice had been served. The weeks following Brandon Blake's arrest were filled with the kind of tension that only comes with a case as deeply personal as the one Detective Sarah Parker had just solved. The courtroom loomed on the horizon, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Even with the arrest, the evidence, and Jessica's testimony, the complexity of the case had left an unsettling aftertaste. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of finality. The courthouse in downtown Chicago was abuzz with activity, a stark contrast to the quiet, emotional days Parker had spent reviewing the case. She stood at the back of the courtroom, watching as Jessica, her children, and even Ryan took their seats. Jessica looked stronger now, but Parker could see the wariness in her eyes, the weight of what had happened still hanging over her. The prosecution's case was solid. They had the physical evidence, the poisoned ice cream, the medical reports showing traces of the lethal substance, and Brandon's own behavior leading up to the poisoning. Brandon's defense, on the other hand, was not nearly as compelling. His lawyer attempted to paint him as someone who had acted out of desperation, driven by love and heartbreak, but no matter how they tried to spin it, there was no denying the truth. Brandon had tried to destroy Jessica's life in the most cruel way imaginable. Parker sat quietly, her mind not on the arguments, but on the chilling psychology behind Brandon's actions. His jealousy hadn't been born out of love. It had been born out of a desire to possess, to control, and to destroy anyone who threatened his warped vision of the future. It was this darkness that had led him down the path to murder. When it was Brandon's turn to speak, the courtroom held its breath. He stood, his once confident posture now slumped in defeat. His eyes were dull, and his face bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had lost everything. His lawyer had prepared him for this moment, but no amount of preparation could shield him from the weight of his own guilt. I never meant for it to go this far," Brandon began, his voice cracking. "I thought I could win her back. I loved her so much. But when I saw her with Ryan, when I realized she was really moving on, something inside me just snapped." Parker felt a chill run through her at his words. His confession was chilling in its simplicity, but it was also filled with a haunting sense of entitlement. Brandon didn't speak of remorse for the damage he'd caused to Jessica or her children. He spoke of himself, his own pain, and his own loss. His entire world had been centered around his own desires, his own need for control. "I loved her," Brandon continued, his voice shaking. "But I couldn't let her go. I thought if I made her sick, if I made her suffer the way I was suffering, she would come back to me. I didn't mean for the kids to eat it. I just wanted her to feel the way I felt. Alone. Empty." The courtroom was silent as the truth settled in. There it was, the heart of the case. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a crime of possession, a twisted belief that Brandon owned Jessica, that her happiness was something he had the right to destroy. Parker's stomach churned as she listened to him, but she didn't allow her emotions to show. The case was almost over, but the true depth of Brandon's obsession was still hard to comprehend. It was Jessica's turn next, and Parker watched her as she stood before the court, her body trembling, but her resolve clear. She had been through hell, but now she was determined to make sure Brandon faced justice for what he had done. She had spent days recovering, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Her children were safe now, and Ryan had been a constant source of support throughout everything. "Brandon was not the person I thought he was," Jessica began, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overtake her. "I believed that when we ended our relationship, we could both move on. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't stay with someone who didn't respect me, who couldn't see that I had a right to be happy." She paused, swallowing hard. "The night of the poisoning, I thought I was just saying goodbye. I thought I was closing a chapter of my life. But instead, he tried to take everything from me. He poisoned me, and he poisoned my children. I trusted him once. I never thought it would end like this." Jessica's words hit the courtroom with a heavy impact. There was no room for doubt now. Brandon's actions had been deliberate, and Jessica's pain was evident in every word she spoke. Her bravery in standing up against him was not lost on anyone. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Brandon Blake was found guilty of attempted murder, child endangerment, and poisoning. The courtroom erupted into a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and sadness. Jessica had fought for justice, and she had gotten it, but the scars of the experience would stay with her forever. Brandon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions had not just harmed Jessica, but had devastated her children and destroyed any chance of healing for them. There would be no redemption for him, no second chance. As Parker left the courthouse, she couldn't help but reflect on the case. Brandon's jealousy had been the driving force behind everything, but it was more than just jealousy. It was an inability to let go, an obsession that turned toxic and deadly. But now at least, Jessica had the chance to rebuild her life. Jessica had decided to stay with Ryan, and together they would work towards healing. Her children were in therapy, and though the trauma of the poisoning would take time to overcome, the fact that they had survived meant there was hope. Jessica had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and found the strength to move forward. Parker stood on the steps of the courthouse, the cold wind brushing against her face. She had solved the case, brought justice to Jessica, and ensured Brandon's dark actions would not go unpunished. But she couldn't shake the image of Jessica, standing tall in the courtroom, taking back control of her life. The case was closed, but the impact would linger for everyone involved. It was a reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and the strength it took to break free from its grip. As Sarah Parker headed to her car, she knew that her work was done, but the case and its lessons would stay with her forever. The days following the trial were a blur of emotions for Jessica. The sense of justice that had been served was bittersweet. While Brandon Blake's conviction had brought a measure of relief, the trauma of the events would stay with her for a long time. The scars weren't just physical, they were mental and emotional. The betrayal she had felt from the man she once loved was still raw, and the memories of that night, the poisoned ice cream, and the near loss of her children haunted her. But amidst the pain, there was a glimmer of hope. Her children were thriving, and with Ryan by her side, she had the support she needed to rebuild. It was no easy road ahead, but Jessica had always been resilient. She had endured much in her life, and now she was determined to move forward. As weeks turned into months, Jessica began to find her footing again. The small victories, her children laughing around the dinner table, the quiet moments of peace at home, and even her slow return to social outings, were all signs that life was beginning to heal. Jessica had started therapy shortly after the trial, not just for herself, but for her children as well. The trauma of being poisoned, of seeing their mother nearly die, was something they would need to process. They were still young, but Jessica could see the growth in them, the way they were beginning to talk about their feelings and express their fears. It wasn't easy, but therapy was helping them heal, just as it was helping her. Ryan had been a constant support throughout everything. His patience, his understanding, and his unwavering commitment to her and her children made Jessica realize how far she had come. The man she had once been with, Brandon, vulnerable, unsure, and seeking validation, was now a woman who had found strength in herself and her family. Jessica had learned to trust again. She had learned that love could be safe and kind. For Brandon Blake, life had come to a grim halt. His conviction had sealed his fate, and he was now serving a life sentence for his actions. There was no redemption for him. The man who had once believed that his love was the only love that mattered, the one who had tried to destroy the lives of those who didn't fit into his obsessive vision, was now isolated in a prison cell. His name was tarnished, his legacy forever linked to the poison he had tried to use to control the woman he could not possess. Detective Sarah Parker had followed Brandon's arrest and sentencing with a sense of satisfaction, but she too had learned something from the case. The depth of human jealousy and obsession was something she would never fully understand, but she knew it was real, and she had seen firsthand the damage it could cause. She had seen Jessica's pain, but she had also seen her strength. That strength was what made Parker's job worthwhile. The knowledge that, even in the face of overwhelming darkness, people could find the will to fight back, to stand tall and move forward. 6 months after the trial, Jessica stood in front of a small gathering of close friends and family, including Ryan and her children. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the first time in a long while that Jessica felt truly at peace, free from the shadow of the past that had loomed over her for so long. "I never thought I'd be standing here again," Jessica said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd be able to love again, to trust again, to be myself again. But here I am, surrounded by people who love me, who want the best for me, and most importantly, who remind me every day that I am worthy of happiness." Ryan stood by her side, his arm wrapped around her waist. She had learned to rely on him, but more than that, she had learned to rely on herself. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. "Jessica, you're stronger than you think," Ryan said, his voice filled with admiration. "And the life ahead of you is one filled with love, joy, and peace. I'll be right here, with you and the kids, every step of the way." The crowd applauded and Jessica smiled through her tears. She had come so far. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. Detective Sarah Parker sat in her office reviewing the final details of the case file. It was over. Brandon Blake was behind bars and Jessica's life had begun to heal. But as she looked out the window, she couldn't help but think about the case that had consumed so much of her time. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about understanding the complexities of human emotions, the darkness that jealousy, obsession, and possession could breed. Parker had seen a lot in her years as a detective, but this case had been different. It had touched her in a way that none of the others had. She had seen the impact of Brandon's actions on Jessica and her children, but she had also witnessed their resilience. They were survivors, and that was the most important thing. In the end, it wasn't the crime that defined this case. It was the strength of the people who had been affected by it. Jessica had lost so much, but in the process, she had gained something even more powerful. A renewed sense of self, a future that was her own, and the love of a family that had fought to stay together. As Jessica closed the door to the past, she opened a new chapter in her life, one filled with the possibility of growth, happiness, and love. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had found strength in the unlikeliest of places and had learned that no matter how dark the night, there was always a new day waiting for her. Ryan, her children, and her friends were there to support her, but it was Jessica herself who had become her own greatest source of strength. She had faced the darkest of days, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future. The chapter on Brandon Blake was over. It was time for Jessica to live the life she deserved, free from the poison of his jealousy and the control he had tried to wield. It was time for her to be free.